A police officer saves a black baby abandoned in the trash. Years later, a tragic news arrived. The city was unusually quiet that night. The cool autumn air brushed against the deserted streets, and the only sound was the echo of David's footsteps. At 29, David was a man accustomed to solitude. The weight of his job as a police officer and the ghosts of his past kept him in a routine that seemed endless. Each night, after a long day at the station, he would walk through his neighborhood, seeking solace in the night's calm, trying to quiet the storm that always raged inside him. But that night, something felt different. There was an unease in his chest that he couldn't ignore. As he walked, his mind drifted to thoughts of Anna, his girlfriend of 2 years. He knew their relationship was in trouble. Anna had always been patient, trying to understand his reluctance to open up emotionally, but over time, that patience had turned to frustration. Their arguments had become more frequent, and David felt the gap between them widening daily. He couldn't blame her. He didn't even understand why it was so hard for him to share his feelings. All he knew was that the pain of his childhood, the loss of his parents, and the time he spent in the orphanage had left him with a void he didn't know how to fill. Lost in these thoughts, David barely noticed when his steps led him into a dark alley, far from his usual route. It was then that he heard it, a faint cry, barely perceptible but unmistakable. The sound stopped him in his tracks. His police training had taught him to always be alert, but this cry was different, something that affected him deeply and instinctively. David looked around, searching for the source of the cry. At first, he saw nothing in the shadows, but as he moved closer to the sound, his heart began to pound. There, among piles of garbage and empty boxes, he saw what appeared to be a small bundle wrapped in dirty blankets. With a growing sense of urgency, David knelt down and carefully lifted the blankets, revealing a tiny baby, her dark skin contrasting with the faded fabric. David's heart stopped for a moment. The baby was trembling, her cry weak, but her eyes, filled with fear and desperation, stared directly at him. It was as if, in those eyes, David saw a reflection of his own childhood, his own abandonment. A mix of horror and tenderness overwhelmed him. How could anyone abandon such a defenseless creature in a place so cold and dark? Without thinking twice, David took off his coat and wrapped the baby in it, trying to give her some warmth. His mind, usually quick and strategic, was blank. All he knew was that he had to protect this child, that he had to make sure nothing bad happened to her. He pulled out his phone with trembling hands and called for an ambulance. As he waited, he looked at the baby, her small eyes blinking slowly, exhaustion and cold clearly weighing on her. David gently stroked her head, and in that gesture he felt a connection he had never experienced before. He couldn't explain it, but in that moment, he knew this child had been placed in his life for a reason. The ambulance arrived shortly after, the red and blue lights illuminating the dark alley. The paramedics took the baby from David's arms and placed her on a stretcher, carrying her into the vehicle. David followed, not leaving her side. He couldn't let her be alone, not after what had happened. As the vehicle sped towards the hospital, David found himself lost in thought, wondering who this baby was, where she had come from, and why he felt that somehow his life had changed forever. The night had started like any other, but for David it would mark the beginning of a new path, one filled with challenges and discoveries, but also an unexpected connection that would make him question everything he had known until now. And as the ambulance drove through the empty streets, David couldn't shake the feeling that, somewhere in that city, someone had decided that he was the person destined to protect this child. A silent promise sealed in the dark alley, among the trash and the cold, when David decided that no matter what happened, he would never let this little one suffer as he had suffered. The hospital lights were cold and bright, contrasting with the warmth David felt every time he looked at the teeny baby now sleeping in an incubator, connected to various wires and machines monitoring her condition. The pneumonia, the doctors told him, was mild but dangerous for such a fragile baby. David had stayed by her side since they arrived at the hospital, not leaving for a second, as if his presence alone could protect her from any other harm that might come her way. As he watched the gentle rise and fall of the baby's chest, his thoughts returned to Anna. He knew she would be worried. He hadn't responded to her messages or calls all night. But how could he explain what had happened? How could he make her understand why he couldn't just leave that baby alone? The connection he felt with the little one, whom he had decided to call Clara, was something he couldn't fully rationalize or explain, even to himself. But he knew with overwhelming certainty that he couldn't walk away from her. Finally, at dawn, David decided to call Anna. Her tone was tense when she answered, and the conversation was brief. Anna was clearly upset by his absence and lack of communication. David tried to explain what had happened, how he had found the abandoned baby, and how he felt he needed to stay by her side. On the other end of the line, Anna was silent for a few moments before letting out a long sigh. "David, I understand that you're a good person," she said finally. "But this is too much. You can't make such impulsive decisions without thinking about the consequences." "It's not impulsive," David replied, feeling a lump in his throat. "Something changed in me when I found that baby. I can't leave her." Anna, frustrated, tried to reason with him. They talked about their plans, about how they had always imagined starting a family, but in their own time, when they were ready. Anna explained that adopting a child he found in a trash bin was an emotional and practical burden they were not prepared to take on. She was worried that David's decision was based on his childhood trauma and an impulse rather than clear reasoning. Anna's words hit him hard. Was it true that he was projecting his own pain onto Clara? That his need to protect her was a way to heal his own wound of abandonment? Maybe she was right, but David knew, deep down, that this was different. It wasn't just about his past. It was about the present. Clara needed him, and he felt that he was meant to be in her life. "Anna, I don't know how to explain it, but I feel this is the right thing to do," he said finally. "I feel like I have to protect her, and I can't turn back now." The tension in Anna's voice was palpable. There was love between them, but also an invisible barrier that grew stronger with each word. "David, I can't do this," Anna said, finally letting out her frustration. "I can't continue in a relationship where you make such big decisions without even consulting me. I'm sorry, but I can't be part of this." The words hung in the air like a final blow. After 2 years together, the relationship they had built was crumbling under the reality of the situation. Anna had been his refuge, the person who had helped him out of the darkness. But now that connection was breaking under the weight of a decision David felt he couldn't ignore. "I'm sorry," David said quietly, "but I can't abandon her." The call ended abruptly, and David sat in silence staring at the phone. The pain of losing Anna was intense, but within him, he also felt a determination he had never experienced before. He knew that his decision to adopt Clara would complicate his life, and that it probably wouldn't be the last loss he would suffer because of it, but he was willing to face the consequences. A few hours later, David was called to the hospital's meeting room, where the doctors informed him that Clara was responding well to treatment, and that with luck, she could be discharged in a few days. It was then that he made the decision that he already knew was inevitable. He was going to adopt her. Clara was not just a baby in need of a home. She was a part of his life that he couldn't ignore. It was as if fate had brought them together in some mysterious way, and he wasn't willing to break that bond. David left the hospital with adoption papers in hand, knowing that the path he was about to embark on would not be easy. The bureaucracy would be a challenge, and the system wouldn't make it easy for him as a single man. Moreover, the scars from his breakup with Anna still hurt deeply, but there was no turning back. That night, when he returned home, the silence of his house felt more oppressive than ever. Everything was in order, exactly as he had left it before his life took such a drastic turn. But now, instead of being a refuge, his home felt empty, lacking the warmth he was beginning to imagine with Clara by his side. David sat on the edge of his bed, the adoption papers next to him. The decision was made, and although he knew there would be difficult days ahead, he also knew that he had never been so sure of anything in his life. Clara was going to be part of his world, and he would do everything possible to give her the life she deserved. Before turning off the lights to try and sleep, he looked at his phone one more time. There were no new messages from Anna. He closed his eyes, allowing himself to feel the pain of the breakup, but also the hope of what was to come. It was a bittersweet feeling, but in his heart, David knew he had made the right decision. The next day, he would officially begin his battle to adopt Clara. But in his mind, he was already her father. And that bond was the strongest thing he had felt in a long time. The dawn brought a new day, but for David, the weight of the decision made the previous night still lingered. He got up early, with the same routine as always, but everything felt different. Now, every movement, every thought was focused on a single goal: adopting Clara and making her his daughter. David arrived at the hospital with a mix of determination and nervousness. Clara was still in the incubator, but her condition was visibly improving. The little one had regained some color in her cheeks, and her eyes, though still weak, seemed more alert. David approached her, smiling tenderly as he saw how she reacted to his presence. "Hi, little one," he whispered, gently stroking her head. "Soon I'll take you home, I promise." The path to adoption wouldn't be easy, he knew that. That very morning, he headed to the social services department to start the process. The wait was long, and as he watched the hustle and bustle of the office, David couldn't help but feel like a fish out of water. He had faced criminals, handled high-tension situations, but being there, waiting to speak with a social worker, made him feel a vulnerability he hadn't experienced before. Finally, he was called into a small office, where a social worker with a kind face but a professional and analytical look received him. She introduced herself as Carmen Diaz, and though her tone was cordial, David could sense the reservation in her voice. "Officer Montoya, it's a pleasure to meet you," Carmen said, offering him a seat. "I understand you're here to talk about the possibility of adopting a baby you recently found, correct?" David nodded, feeling a knot in his stomach as Carmen began asking questions. The conversation touched on topics David hadn't fully anticipated: his personal history, his childhood in the orphanage, his financial situation, his work schedule as a police officer, and of course his personal life, now marked by the recent breakup with Anna. "I understand you've been in a stable relationship for 2 years, but that you're currently single," Carmen said, reviewing her notes. "Being a single parent, especially a police officer with a demanding schedule, can be extremely difficult. Are you sure this is the best decision for you and the child?" David felt the pressure of her words. He knew his answers would determine whether he could proceed with the adoption. He took a deep breath before speaking, choosing his words carefully. "I understand the challenges of being a single parent, and I know my job isn't easy, but I also know what it's like to grow up without a family, without someone to protect you and love you unconditionally. Clara was abandoned, left to die, and I can't let her go through what I went through. I believe that despite the challenges, I can give her the love and security she needs. I'm willing to make any sacrifice necessary to ensure she grows up in a home filled with love." Carmen observed him in silence for a moment, assessing the sincerity in his words. Finally, she nodded slowly. "I appreciate your honesty and commitment, Officer Montoya. But you must understand that this process will be long and complicated. There will be thorough evaluations, both of you and your home. We need to ensure that Clara is in the safest and most loving environment possible." David nodded, feeling a mix of relief and fear. He knew he was starting a difficult process, but he was willing to face it. No matter how many tests or reviews he had to pass, he would do whatever it took to bring Clara home. In the following days, David began to adjust his life in preparation for Clara's arrival. The house, which had been a solitary refuge, began to transform. He took a few days off from the station, dedicating every moment to making his home more welcoming for the little one. He painted a room a soft pastel color, installed a crib he had bought from a nearby store, and filled the room with toys and clothes he had carefully chosen. Every step he took in preparing his home for Clara brought him closer to his goal, but it also filled him with doubt. Carmen's words kept echoing in his mind. Being a single parent, especially a police officer, can be extremely difficult. David couldn't ignore the reality of his situation. His job was demanding, and there were moments when violence and danger seemed omnipresent. Could he really keep Clara safe and give her the life she deserved? Amid these concerns, David found support in Elena, the hospital nurse who had been caring for Clara. Elena had seen David's dedication and was moved by his determination. When David returned to the hospital to see Clara, Elena approached him. "David, I've seen how you care for Clara, and I know you're the right person to give her a home," Elena said with a warm smile. "I know you're facing a lot of doubts, but I want you to know you're not alone in this. If you need help, advice, or just someone to talk to, I'm here for you." Elena's words were a balm to David's heart. Knowing he had someone to rely on, someone who understood the situation and was willing to help, gave him the strength he needed to keep going. Meanwhile, at the station, his best friend Mark Ortiz also gave him unwavering support. Mark had been his partner for years and knew the internal demons David struggled with. When David told him about his decision to adopt Clara, Mark didn't show surprise, only a fierce loyalty. "You know I've got your back in this, brother," Mark said, giving him a pat on the back. "If anyone can do this, it's you, and you're not alone. I'll be here to help with whatever you need, whether at work or at home." With the backing of Elena and Mark, David felt he could face any obstacle in his path. The bureaucracy would be exhausting, the interviews and evaluations would be strenuous, but each day brought him a little closer to his goal. Clara was still in the hospital, but David already considered her his daughter, and he was determined to fight with all his strength to ensure she had a future filled with love and security. The days turned into weeks, and the adoption process moved forward, albeit slowly. Each visit from a social worker, each psychological evaluation, and each review of his home were necessary steps on a path that seemed endless. But David was undeterred. He knew he was doing the right thing, and every time he looked at Clara's room, every time he thought about the day he would finally bring her home, he felt a renewed sense of hope. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, David received a call that filled him with emotion. The hospital informed him that Clara was strong enough to be discharged. Although the adoption process wasn't yet complete, Clara could spend time with him at home, under the supervision of the Social Services Department. David prepared to welcome Clara into his home, filled with a mix of nervousness and joy. He knew the challenges were just beginning, but he also knew that, for the first time in a long time, he had found a real purpose in his life. Clara was that purpose, and he was willing to make any sacrifice necessary to be the best father he could be for her. The road ahead was uncertain, but with Clara by his side, David felt he could face anything. He had embarked on a battle that would transform his life, and although the future was uncertain, it was full of hope and love, something David hadn't felt in a long time. David's life began to take on a new rhythm with Clara in his home. The little one filled the house with a joy David had never experienced before. Although the adoption process was still ongoing, the possibility of having her close, caring for her, and seeing her recover day by day gave him the strength to keep going. However, just as he was beginning to find a sense of stability, a shadow began to loom over his life. One morning, while David was playing with Clara on the living room floor, his phone rang, interrupting the moment. Seeing the number on the screen, his face tensed. It was a call from the station. He answered quickly, hearing the captain's grave voice on the other end of the line. "David, I need you to come to the station immediately. It's urgent," the captain said, his tone leaving no room for questions. David's heart began to pound. He had taken a few days off to adjust to his new life with Clara, and he hadn't expected to be called back so soon. With a quick kiss on Clara's forehead, he left her in the care of the temporary nanny he had hired and headed to the station with a mix of worry and confusion. Upon arrival, David noticed something was wrong. The atmosphere at the station was unusually tense. The murmurs ceased as he entered, and several of his colleagues looked at him with a mix of distrust and resentment. The unease in his stomach grew as he walked towards the captain's office. When he entered, he found the captain sitting behind his desk, accompanied by Sergeant Munoz, a veteran officer known for his seriousness and uncompromising character. Munoz had always been a respected figure, someone David admired from a distance, although he had never had a close relationship with him. "Officer Montoya, take a seat," the captain ordered, pointing to the chair in front of him. David obeyed, feeling the weight of the situation. The captain had a grim expression as he held a file in his hands. "David, we've received a very serious allegation against you," the captain began, his voice grave and measured. You're being accused of accepting bribes in a recent case." The words fell like a bomb. David felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Bribes? Him? It was impossible. His mind raced, searching for an explanation, an error, a misunderstanding, but the captain continued before he could react. "The evidence against you is quite strong," Munoz added, his tone cold and distant. "Suspicious bank transfers have been found in your account, and there are witness testimonies claiming to have seen you accepting money during an operation." David was stunned. He didn't know what to say. This couldn't be happening. Never in his entire career had he compromised his integrity. Being a police officer was more than a job for him. It was his way of making up for the pain and injustice he had suffered in his life. Munoz's words hit him with a force he hadn't anticipated, but the worst was yet to come. "Due to the seriousness of the allegations, you will be suspended from duty while an internal investigation is conducted," the captain said, avoiding eye contact. "I understand this is hard to accept, but we must follow protocol." David felt the air escape his lungs. Being suspended meant much more than temporarily losing his job. It meant that everything he had worked for, including his fight to adopt Clara, was in jeopardy. Without his salary, he wouldn't be able to maintain the house or provide for Clara. But beyond the material, his reputation was being destroyed. How could anyone believe that he, of all people, had accepted bribes? "This is a mistake, Captain," he finally said, his voice trembling with indignation. "I haven't done anything wrong. Someone is trying to frame me." The captain looked at him with a mix of sadness and firmness. "That's what we'll try to find out, David. But until then, you must understand that we can't allow you to continue in service. This investigation could take weeks, even months." The words sank into David like knives. He rose slowly from the chair, as if the weight of the situation was crushing him. "I'm going to clear my name, Captain," he said with determination, looking directly at Munoz. "I promise." Munoz showed no emotion, simply nodding his head. "I hope so, Montoya," he responded. "For now, follow orders and cooperate with the investigation." David left the office feeling more alone than ever. The murmurs that had ceased earlier now grew louder. His colleagues, those he had worked alongside, now looked at him as a traitor. The feeling of isolation was unbearable. That night, David returned home without saying a word. Clara, unaware of what was happening, greeted him with a smile that broke his heart. He knelt beside her, feeling a mix of despair and guilt. How could he protect her if he couldn't even protect himself? The days that followed were hell. Without work, and with the uncertainty of the investigation weighing on him, David found himself struggling not only for his reputation, but also to keep Clara safe. Financial tensions began to mount, forcing him to look for odd jobs to keep the household afloat. But even those jobs were hard to come by, as the rumor of the investigation had spread quickly. During this time, Mark, his best friend, was his only source of unwavering support. Mark refused to believe the accusations and visited regularly, reminding David that he wasn't alone in this fight. "David, this is clearly a setup," Mark said one afternoon as they sat on the porch. "Someone is trying to destroy you, and we can't let them get away with it." But despite to Mark's support, the stress began to take a toll on David's health. The sleepless nights, the constant worry about Clara, and the struggle to clear his name were slowly consuming him. There were moments when despair overwhelmed him, but in those moments a simple hug from Clara, her laughter, or her first attempts at speaking filled him with renewed strength. It was in the midst of this chaos that Charlie Vega, the private detective he had met months before, approached David with a proposal. "I heard about what's happening to you," Charlie said, serious. "I can't stand by while someone like you is destroyed by a corrupt system. Let me help you find the truth." Charlie began investigating on his own, and what he uncovered was disturbing. The evidence against David, the bank transfers and the testimonies, seemed to have been manipulated. The financial documents had inconsistencies, and some of the witnesses who supposedly saw David accepting bribes couldn't be located. As Charlie and Mark dug deeper, they began to suspect that someone within the very precinct, someone with power, was behind all of this. The name that came up repeatedly was Sergeant Munoz. Charlie uncovered that Munoz had been involved in several shady cases over the years, but he had always come out clean thanks to his network of influence within the police. This revelation was a ray of hope for David, but it also filled him with a new kind of fear. If Munoz was really behind all this, it meant he was facing a formidable enemy, someone who wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to protect his position and secrets. But despite the danger, David knew he couldn't give up. For Clara, for his future, for everything he had lost, he had to fight. And as the truth began to surface, he realized this fight was not just for him. It was for all those who had been victims of a corrupt system, who had been silenced or destroyed by people in positions of power. The battle was just beginning, and David was ready to face whatever it took to clear his name and protect his daughter. As the pieces of the puzzle started falling into place, he prepared for what he knew would be the toughest confrontation of his life. The air in David's apartment was thick, heavy with tension and expectation. Charlie Vega had become a frequent visitor, bringing reports and evidence that slowly began to unravel the plot, threatening to destroy David's life. Every day a new piece of the puzzle fell into place, and with each revelation, the figure of Sergeant Munoz grew darker and more dangerous. Charlie and Mark sat at David's small dining table, spreading documents and photos across the surface. David, holding Clara in his arms, remained silent, watching as the pieces began to form a clear but terrifying picture. "Here's the bank transfer that supposedly incriminates you," Charlie said, pointing to a bank statement. "But look at this. There are tiny inconsistencies in the transaction codes, something most people wouldn't notice. Someone tampered with these records, probably from within the bank, to make it look like you accepted a bribe." David clenched his jaw, feeling a mix of relief and fury. It was further proof that he had been deliberately framed, but it also meant they were dealing with someone who had powerful resources and connections. "And that's not all," Charlie continued, lifting a folder of witness testimonies. "The witnesses who claim they saw you taking bribes, one of them wasn't even in town on the day in question. And the other, according to my contacts, has a criminal record that Munoz helped disappear. This kind of manipulation requires a level of influence that only someone in a high position like Munoz could have." Mark, who had been silent, frowned and looked at David seriously. "This confirms what we feared, David. Munoz isn't just trying to destroy you, he's protecting something much bigger. He's got an entire network working for him, and he's probably been doing this for years." David felt a surge of rage and despair. The situation was worse than he had imagined. It wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about facing a man who had been operating in the shadows, using his power to manipulate, incriminate, and protect his own corrupt interests. How many more lives had Munoz ruined? "We have to take this to the captain," David finally said, with determination. "We need to expose him before he can do more damage." Charlie nodded, but his expression was cautious. "Yes, but we have to be careful. If Munoz suspects we're onto him, he could try to destroy the evidence or even take more drastic measures. We need more solid proof before making any moves, something that incriminates him beyond a doubt, something that even his allies in the precinct can't ignore." David knew Charlie was right, but every day that passed was a risk. His suspension, the struggle for Clara's adoption, and the financial pressure were taking a toll. However, he had no choice but to keep going. He couldn't afford to fail, not when Clara's life and his own future depended on it. In the days that followed, Charlie and Mark intensified their investigation. Charlie, using his contacts, managed to access internal records from the precinct and the history of operations that Munoz had led in the past. What they found was terrifying, a pattern of corruption and cover-ups that spanned years, with Munoz using his position to manipulate cases and protect certain individuals in exchange for favors and money. But the hardest blow came when Charlie discovered a direct connection between Munoz and the prostitution ring operating in the city. A ring that Clara's biological mother had tried to escape. According to the records, Munoz had been leading operations to dismantle the ring, but in reality, he was covering for the real ringleaders and making sure that any witness or victim who might speak out was silenced. "This explains why Clara's mother was killed," Charlie said one night while reviewing the files in David's apartment. "She knew too much, and when she tried to escape and protect her daughter, she became a threat to Munoz's operation. He didn't just cover up her murder, he probably ordered it. David felt the world collapsing around him. The idea that the man who had manipulated his life, destroying it piece by piece, was also responsible for the death of Clara's mother filled him with a rage he could barely contain. But amid that anger, he also felt a renewed determination. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about justice for Clara and her mother. "We have to bring this to light," David said, his voice firm. "Not just for me, but for all the people who have been victims of this monster. We can't let him continue operating in the shadows." Charlie and Mark nodded, knowing that time was running out. They carefully prepared the evidence, documenting every irregularity, every connection, every crime that Munoz had committed or covered up. They knew the confrontation would be dangerous, but they were ready to face it. The investigation was reaching its critical point. The evidence was piling up, and the web of lies that Munoz had woven was beginning to unravel. But David also knew that confronting Munoz directly wouldn't be easy. The sergeant had allies, people willing to protect him at all costs, and any misstep could result in disaster. However, there was no turning back. David was determined to fight to the end, to confront Munoz and expose the truth, no matter the cost. He knew that by doing so, he wasn't just fighting for his own life, but also for justice for Clara, and for all those who had been silenced by corruption. The moment ended with a decision made and a plan in motion. David, Charlie, and Mark were ready to take the battle directly to Munoz's door. What happened next would determine not only David's future, but also the fate of all those whose lives had been touched by the darkness that Munoz represented. The shadows of the past began to emerge with unsettling clarity, revealing the dark truth about Clara's biological mother and her tragic fate. David, Charlie, and Mark were deeply immersed in their investigation, following every lead, every connection that brought them closer to the truth. However, what they discovered about Clara and her mother's past left them with a feeling of helplessness and fury. Charlie had managed to access confidential records, documents detailing undercover operations related to the prostitution ring in the city. As they reviewed the reports, a chilling pattern began to emerge. The name of a young woman listed in the files as an unidentified witness appeared in several reports, but always with a tragic fate, disappearance, without a trace. "Here she is," Charlie said, pointing to the document with a grim expression. "This is Clara's mother. Her name was Lucia Perez. She was captured by the prostitution ring when she was just a teenager and forced to work for them. She was trapped with no way out until she discovered she was pregnant." David felt sick as he read the details. Lucia had been a brave young woman who, despite the terrible circumstances, decided to fight for her life and that of her daughter. She knew she couldn't stay in that place, that she had to escape to save her baby from a similar fate. "This is where it all gets darker," Charlie continued, moving to another report. "Lucia managed to escape the ring, but she was being hunted. The mafia wanted to make sure she didn't talk, and Munoz was in charge of the operations to capture her. Only instead of protecting her, he was making sure she was never seen again." David clenched his fists, feeling a powerless rage. Lucia had been relentlessly pursued, and although she had managed to give birth to Clara, her freedom was brief. She was found and brutally executed by the mafia under Munoz's orders to ensure their operation remained in the shadows. She left Clara in that alley, hoping someone kind-hearted would find her before the mafia reached her, Mark said, his voice heavy with emotion. She knew she had no chance of surviving, but she was willing to sacrifice her life to give her daughter a chance. David felt the weight of Lucia's story crushing him. The image of Clara's mother, terrified and alone, making the ultimate sacrifice for her daughter, left him speechless. The knowledge that Clara was the result of such a desperate act, and that her mother had paid the highest price, filled him with a mix of sadness, fury, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. "She didn't die in vain," David finally said, his voice breaking. "She fought for Clara, and now it's my turn to fight for her. I won't let Lucia's death be in vain. Clara will grow up knowing her mother was a brave woman, and I'll make sure Munoz pays for what he did." The silence in the room was heavy, filled with determination and pain. David, Mark, and Charlie knew they had to continue with their plan, but now they had an even stronger motivation to seek justice for Lucia and for all the victims who had fallen under the control of Munoz and the ring he had protected for so long. The next step in their investigation was to gather evidence that directly linked Munoz to the prostitution ring and Lucia's murder. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but Charlie had contacts in the underworld, people who had heard rumors, whispers, of what was really happening behind Munoz's operations. With the help of one of those contacts, they managed to locate a former mafia member who had decided to speak out, a man named Esteban, who had been present at Lucia's capture. Esteban, now distanced from crime and living under a false identity, was willing to testify about what he had seen in exchange for protection. The meeting with Esteban was tense. They met in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a discreet place where they could talk without fear of being overheard. Esteban, a middle-aged man with a tired, remorseful look, recounted Lucia's last night with a broken voice. "Lucia was a brave woman," Esteban said. "She knew she was being hunted, but she didn't let fear stop her. She tried to escape, but we found her. Munoz was the one who gave the order to kill her. He said that once we found her, there should be no loose ends. He didn't care about the baby. He just wanted her to disappear." David listened in silence, feeling that each word was like a dagger to his heart. Munoz's coldness, his indifference to the life of an innocent woman and her child, filled him with a fury he could barely contain. "I can testify against Munoz," Esteban continued, "but I need protection. If he knows I talked, they won't hesitate to come after me." David nodded, knowing that Esteban's testimony could be the final piece they needed to incriminate Munoz beyond any doubt. "We'll protect you," David responded firmly. "We'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." With Esteban's statement and the evidence they had gathered, David, Charlie, and Mark began to prepare their case against Munoz. They knew time was running out, that any mistake could be fatal, but they were ready to see this through to the end. They knew the confrontation with Munoz would be dangerous, but they also knew they had the truth on their side. David, strengthened by Lucia's story and her sacrifice, was more determined than ever to seek justice, not just for himself and Clara, but for all the victims who had been silenced for so many years. The next step would be to expose Munoz, but they knew it wouldn't be easy. The final battle was just around the corner, and David was prepared to face it all, with the memory of Lucia as his guide and the promise of a better future for Clara as his greatest motivation. The moment of truth was near. David, Charlie, and Mark knew that the confrontation with Munoz would be dangerous, but they also knew there was no turning back. With the evidence in hand, including Esteban's testimony, they prepared for the hardest confrontation of their lives. David had spent the previous night awake, thinking about what he was about to do. He knew he was risking not only his career, but also his life and those he loved. But the memory of Lucia, Clara's mother, and the sacrifice she had made for her daughter filled him with an unyielding determination. He couldn't allow Munoz to continue operating in the shadows, destroying lives and perpetuating the cycle of corruption. Early in the morning, he met with Charlie and Mark at a small cafe near the precinct. The atmosphere was tense, and the gravity of what they were about to do weighed heavily on them. "Today is the day," Charlie said, his voice firm but laden with concern. "We have everything we need to expose Munoz, but let's not underestimate what he might do to protect himself." Mark nodded, crossing his arms over his chest. "Munoz has allies, people in the precinct who will back him no matter what, but we have the truth on our side, and that's what will make the difference." David looked at his friends, feeling a wave of gratitude. He knew he couldn't have come this far without them, and the fact that they were willing to risk so much for him and Clara meant more than words could express. "No matter what happens today, I want you to know I'm grateful for everything you've done," David said, his voice filled with emotion. "This isn't just for me, it's for Clara, and for all the people who have suffered at Munoz's hands." Charlie and Mark nodded, knowing that the path they had chosen was dangerous, but necessary. After a final review of the evidence, they headed to the precinct. The drive to the precinct was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, David felt a knot in his stomach. The building he had considered his second home for so many years now felt strange, almost hostile. He knew that what he was about to do would change his life forever. They walked in together, with the documents and Esteban's statement ready to be presented. But as they crossed the doors, they felt all eyes on them. There were rumors, whispers, but no one dared to say anything out loud. David could see the fear and distrust in the faces of his colleagues. They knew something big was about to happen, but they couldn't imagine the magnitude of what was coming. They went up to the second floor where the captain's office was located. The door was open, and the captain looked at them with a mixture of surprise and concern as they entered. Next to him, Sergeant Munoz stood, his expression unchanging, though David noticed a flicker of something in his eyes, as if he suspected what was about to happen. "David, Charlie, Mark," said the captain, rising from his desk. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this early visit?" David exchanged a glance with Charlie and Mark before stepping forward. "Captain, we're here to present evidence of a serious corruption case involving a high-ranking officer in this precinct," David said, his voice steady, though his hands trembled slightly. The captain frowned, his gaze becoming more intense. "What are you talking about, David?" Before David could respond, Munoz intervened, his tone icy. "This is nonsense, Captain. Clearly Montoya is trying to deflect attention from the charges against him." David felt a surge of anger but stood firm. "This is no nonsense, Munoz. We have evidence linking you directly to the city's prostitution ring and the execution of Lucia Perez, Clara's biological mother," David said, pulling out documents and handing them to the captain. The captain took them, his expression shifting from disbelief to concern as he read. Charlie and Mark added more details, explaining how they had uncovered evidence manipulation, Munoz's connections to the local mafia, and how he had used his position to cover up his crimes for years. Seeing his facade start to crumble, Munoz tried to take control of the situation. "This is a farce, Captain. They're trying to destroy me because they know I've been relentless in the fight against crime in this city. They can't let someone like me, who has dedicated his life to service, be incriminated by lies and falsehoods." But the evidence was too strong. The captain looked up from the documents, his face pale. "Munoz, this evidence is—" he began, but Munoz interrupted. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Munoz shouted, his tone full of rage and desperation. "I won't fall because of the lies of a corrupt cop and a couple of charlatans." David stepped forward, facing Munoz directly. "The only corrupt person here is you, Munoz, and today is the day everything comes to light. You can't keep hiding behind your badge. You've destroyed lives, manipulated the system for your gain, and made innocent people pay for your crimes. But that ends now." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. The captain, regaining control, called in several high-ranking officers to review the evidence. Munoz tried to resist, but he was finally detained and escorted out of the precinct, shouting threats as he was taken away. The blow was devastating for the precinct. Munoz's downfall shook the foundation of the institution, revealing a network of corruption that had operated in the shadows for years. For David, it was a bittersweet victory. He had won the battle, but at a great personal cost. He knew the war wasn't over. There was still much to be done to clean up the system and protect Clara. As news of Munoz's arrest spread through the city, David felt a mixture of relief and sadness. He had exposed the truth, but the price had been high. His reputation, his personal life, everything had been put on the line. But looking at Clara, he knew he had done the right thing. David, leaving the precinct with Charlie and Mark by his side, knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that with the truth on their side, they could face any challenge. And as he held Clara in his arms, he vowed that he would never let her mother's sacrifice be in vain. Munoz's arrest had shaken the foundations of the precinct, and the news quickly spread throughout the city. The media wasted no time in picking up the story. A veteran officer, a seemingly untouchable figure, had been unmasked as the mastermind behind a network of corruption and crimes that spanned years. Munoz's fall not only exposed the corruption within the precinct, but also revealed the extent of the criminal operations he had covered up for so long. David, though relieved by Munoz's arrest, knew that the battle was far from over. With the fall of such a powerful man, many others who had been protected by him were beginning to feel vulnerable, and that would have consequences. As the case moved toward trial, the pressure on David, Charlie, and Mark increased. They knew that those who had been aligned with Munoz might try to prevent the full truth from coming to light. Days after the arrest, David was called back to the precinct, this time by the captain, who wanted to discuss the next steps. Upon arrival, the atmosphere was different. There was an air of respect, but also of caution. Many of his colleagues, who had once looked at him with suspicion, now saw him with admiration, though they couldn't shake the discomfort of knowing that one of their own had been responsible for so much corruption. In the captain's office, David found a group of high-ranking officers, as well as the district attorney, who was leading the prosecution against Munoz. The captain, who had been a powerless bystander during the revelation of Munoz's corruption, now appeared more determined than ever to clear the precinct's name and bring those responsible to justice. "David, you've done an exceptional job bringing all this to light," the captain said, looking at David with genuine respect. "But we need to make sure that Munoz and everyone involved in his network are brought to justice properly. This is just the beginning." The district attorney, a man with a piercing gaze and an authoritative tone, spoke up. "The case against Munoz is solid, but we can't underestimate the resources and influence he might still have. We need your continued cooperation to ensure that every piece of evidence is presented irrefutably at trial. That means you, Charlie, and Mark need to be ready to testify." David nodded, knowing that testifying would be one of the biggest challenges of his life. Munoz's defense would surely try to discredit him, to cast doubt on his integrity and his motives, but he was prepared to face any attack. He knew that what was at stake was much more than his reputation. It was justice for Lucia, for Clara, and for all the people whose lives had been destroyed by Munoz's corruption. As the trial date approached, tensions in the city rose. Media coverage of the case was intense, and David found himself under constant scrutiny. Journalists tried to get statements from him. His co-workers looked at him with a mix of admiration and fear, and his private life had become a topic of public interest. But despite the pressure, David remained steadfast, focused on what truly mattered, protecting Clara and ensuring that Munoz paid for his crimes. The trial began with a courtroom packed with journalists, lawyers, and onlookers. Munoz, who had always been an intimidating and powerful figure, now appeared vulnerable, though he continued to project a defiant attitude. The charges against him were numerous: corruption, evidence tampering, covering up crimes, and complicity in murder, among others. David was called to testify in the early days of the trial. Stepping onto the stand and facing Munoz's cold gaze was one of the hardest moments of his life, but he did so with his head held high. He recounted every detail of the investigation, from discovering the inconsistencies in the evidence to linking Munoz to the prostitution ring and the murder of Lucia Perez. Munoz's defense tried to discredit David, suggesting that he was acting out of personal vendetta due to his suspension and that he had manipulated the evidence to frame an innocent man. But David, with the help of Charlie and Mark, who also testified, presented a solid case backed by irrefutable evidence. The most compelling testimony came from Esteban, the former mafia member who had been present during Lucia's execution. With the promise of protection and a plea deal, Esteban detailed Munoz's brutality and how he had ordered Lucia's death to protect his own interests. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Munoz's defense was losing ground. The evidence was too overwhelming, and the truth of his crimes was undeniable. The powerful figure who had once been feared by all was now crumbling under the weight of the truth. Finally, after weeks of testimonies and evidence, the jury reached a verdict: guilty on all counts. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the sentence was handed down, and Munoz was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, a look of defeat on his face. The man who had caused so much suffering, who had manipulated the system for so long, was finally facing the consequences of his actions. For David, the victory was bittersweet. He had succeeded in exposing the corruption and bringing Munoz to justice, but the cost had been high. His life would never be the same, and the scars from this battle would stay with him forever. But as he looked at Clara, he knew it had all been worth it. He had secured justice for Lucia, and ensured a safer future for his daughter. With Munoz's fall, the precinct began a process of internal cleansing, dismantling any trace of the corruption that had been present for so long. David was reinstated to his position, this time with a renewed sense of purpose and determination. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to face it. David's life began to take on a different rhythm after the trial and Munoz's conviction. Though the battle had been hard, the final victory brought with it a sense of relief and a new beginning. However, as the precinct recovered from the effects of corruption and David returned to his post, his primary focus was on Clara and on how to build a life filled with love and security for her. Clara, now almost 3 years old, was recovering well. Her early days at David's house had been tough, but slowly the little girl had started to adjust to her new environment. Her health improved significantly, and each day she became more curious and active, exploring her home with the boundless energy of a small child. Although she had been very quiet during this time that day, she was finally starting to open up much more to David. David, for his part, dove into fatherhood with a mix of joy and apprehension. Every day with Clara was a new experience, filled with challenges and moments of happiness that he had never imagined. Though he had faced criminals and dangerous situations in his work, being a father was a completely different challenge. Yet he was determined to do his best for his daughter. One morning, as David was preparing breakfast, Clara, now in the stage of exploring everything around her, approached the little table in the kitchen that David had set up for her. Still clumsy but determined, she tried to reach her cup of milk, and when she succeeded, she turned to David with a proud smile on her face. "Daddy!" Clara said, her voice soft but full of emotion. It was one of the first times she had clearly spoken the word, and the sound of it made David's heart swell with a mix of joy and tenderness. David knelt down and lifted her into his arms, feeling a wave of love that almost overwhelmed him. "Yes, I'm your daddy, little one," he whispered, gently kissing her forehead, "and I'll always be here for you." Those simple yet meaningful moments became the foundation of the new life David was building for both of them. His house, once a lonely and austere place, was now filled with life and laughter. The walls that had once been bare now displayed colorful drawings made by Clara, and his daily routine had transformed into a blend of work responsibilities and special moments with his daughter. However, although David was enjoying his new life as a father, he also knew that there was an inevitable conversation he would eventually have to have with Clara. The little girl was still too young to understand what had happened, but David was mentally preparing for the day when he would have to explain the truth about her origins and the bravery of her biological mother. As the weeks passed, David began to notice that Clara, despite her young age, was a perceptive and strong child. She seemed to understand more than she expressed, and although she hadn't brought up the conversation about her mother again, David knew she remembered. At work, things had also changed. The precinct was undergoing a reconstruction, not only physically, but also in terms of trust and morale. Munoz's downfall had left a deep scar, but it had also opened the door to a new beginning. David, now reinstated to his position, worked tirelessly to ensure that corruption would never take root again. His colleagues, who had initially viewed him with suspicion, now respected him for his integrity and courage. David also kept in touch with Charlie and Mark, who had been his closest allies throughout the ordeal. Although things were returning to normal, they knew there was still much work to be done to completely cleanse Munoz's legacy. However, the sense of camaraderie and loyalty that had formed between them was unbreakable. David and Clara later found themselves walking through the park on a sunny autumn afternoon. As Clara ran through the fallen leaves, David watched her with a smile on his face. Despite all the challenges, they had reached a place of peace. He knew that life wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that he was surrounded by people who supported him and that he was building a bright future for his daughter. Clara's new life was full of love, care, and opportunities. And although the past would always be a part of her story, David was determined to make the future as happy and safe as possible. With Clara by his side, he knew he could face anything, and as they walked hand in hand into the sunset, he knew that, for the first time in a long time, everything was all right. Winter had covered the city with a blanket of snow, and as the streets filled with silence, David and Clara continued to adjust to their new life together. Despite the peace they had achieved, David couldn't shake a persistent unease. He knew that the truth about Clara's story and that of her mother, Lucia, needed to be fully revealed, and the weight of that responsibility followed him every day. Clara, now almost 3 years old, had become a curious and lively child, full of questions about the world around her. Her questions about her biological mother had become more frequent, and David knew that the time had come to tell her the truth, though he feared what that conversation might mean for both of them. One afternoon, as the snow gently fell, David decided that he could no longer postpone the conversation. He opened a small chest he had kept in his room, taking out some photos and a letter he had written long ago. Then he asked Clara to bundle up warmly, and together they left the house, heading to the cemetery where Lucia's remains rested. The drive was quiet, with Clara gazing out the window as the snowy landscape passed by. David, his heart racing, knew that he was about to face one of the most difficult conversations of his life, but he also knew it was necessary. When they arrived at the cemetery, Clara looked at him curiously. "Daddy, where are we going?" she asked, holding his hand tightly as they walked among the snow-covered graves. David stopped in front of Lucia's grave, placed the flowers he had brought, and then knelt beside Clara. "We're here to visit someone very special, Clara. Someone who loved you very much and will always be with you, even though you can't see her," he said, pointing to Lucia's grave. Clara frowned, trying to understand. Her small hand gently touched the cold tombstone as she looked at David with innocent, confused eyes. "Daddy, who is she?" she asked, her voice trembling. And David felt the weight of the words pressing down on him, but he knew he had to be honest. "She's your mum, Clara, your biological mum. Her name was Lucia, and she was an incredibly brave woman. She did everything she could to protect you and make sure you were safe." Clara stared at him, her eyes beginning to fill with tears. "Why isn't she here with us?" she whispered. David took a deep breath and hugged her tightly. "Your mum made a great sacrifice, Clara. There were bad people who tried to hurt her, and even though she fought with all her might, she couldn't stay with us. But what she did out of love for you. She wanted you to have a safe and happy life, and that's why she gave her life to save you." Tears began to roll down Clara's cheeks, and David felt his heart break as he saw the pain in his daughter's eyes. The little girl clung to her father, sobbing into his shoulder as she tried to grasp the magnitude of what he had told her. "She loved you more than anything in this world, Clara," David said, stroking her hair. "And even though she's not here physically, she'll always be with you, watching over you and loving you from heaven." Clara remained silent for a long time, holding on to her father as the tears continued to flow. David held her tightly, giving her all the love and comfort he could. He knew the truth was hard to accept, but he also knew it was necessary. Finally, Clara looked up at him, her eyes red but filled with determination. "I want her to know that I'm happy with you, Daddy," she said in a trembling voice. David felt a mix of sadness and pride at those words. He gently kissed Clara's forehead and nodded. "She knows, sweetheart. I'm sure she knows, and I know she's very proud of you." Together, they stayed a while longer in front of Lucia's grave, in silence, letting the moment envelop them. The snow continued to fall softly, covering the world around them with a white blanket, as if time itself had stopped. On the way back home, the silence between David and Clara was filled with a new understanding. Although Clara was still too young to fully comprehend her mother's story, sharing it had strengthened the bond between them. It was a necessary step in their journey together, a step that would allow them to move forward with greater strength and unity. That night, as Clara slept in his arms, David reflected on everything they had been through. The truth he had shared with Clara was painful, but also liberating. He had faced the past and shared it with his daughter, giving her the tools to understand her own story and find peace in it. However, as he watched her sleep, a persistent feeling of unease washed over him. He knew he had done the right thing by telling her the truth, but he also knew that the past had a way of reappearing when least expected. Would Clara, when she was older, be able to fully accept her story? Or would the pain of her mother's sacrifice haunt her in some way? David decided to write a letter to Clara, a letter he would keep for the future, for the day when she would be ready to understand the full magnitude of her story. In the letter, he spoke of her mother's love, the sacrifice she had made, and his own journey as her adoptive father. He spoke of the difficulties they faced, but also of the love that united them and made them stronger. As he wrote, David realized that there was no easy answer to what the future would hold, but there was one thing he was certain of: his unconditional love for Clara. That love would be his guide, his strength, and the foundation on which they would build the rest of their lives. When he finished writing the letter, he carefully placed it in the same chest where he had kept Lucia's photos. Then he returned to Clara's room, where he sat by her bed, watching her sleep peacefully. The future was uncertain, but in that moment David felt a deep sense of peace. They had faced the truth together, and though the road ahead would not be easy, they were ready to face it. He knew that Clara would grow up surrounded by love, understanding that while her story was marked by sacrifice, it was also filled with hope and possibilities. Life wouldn't always be perfect, but as long as they were together, they could overcome any obstacle. And as the first light of dawn began to illuminate the room, David closed his eyes, knowing that they had reached a place of peace where the past and the present united to form a future full of promise. And that's the end of our story. If you liked it, give it a like and subscribe for more. See you in the next story. Until next time.